I don't know if you've been following the events in France the last couple of days. By the way, you can, those of you who know French, you can get TF1 at France 2, I prefer strongly the latter, on your computers if you want to follow it. Just go to google.fr or just go to Google and type in France 2 or type in TF1, and you can get the news from 1 o'clock, that is 13h, or from 20h, from 8 o'clock at night. And my other two universities, Rouen and Lyon 2, are completely shut down, and Rennes and Tours and Toulouse, because this is a law it's going to come into effect called the Loi Persists, after the person who proposed it. And what it's going to do is it's going to, among other things, it's going to make the budgets of each university kind of independent. It's an attempt to, this is a logical transition into our topic today, to Americanize French universities, so that in a way the result, and which the students don't like, is you already have sort of a gap between the really good universities like Paris 1 or Lyon 2, and the ones that just sort of struggle along. Many of them new ones like the Pas de Calais, that a friend of mine actually set up, and when he was in the ministry, and the little ones like Chambéry and Besançon and all the others. And because of the conditions that are so difficult in French universities, which are woefully understaffed, and the ones that were built in the early 60s and early 70s, like the infamous Villetaneuse, and which is where I've given a talk once, was Paris. I think it's Paris 14, and the conditions are just very, very dreadful. So there's been a lot of opposition there, and then now that Sarkozy is president, that the police, there was these interventions musclées, or kind of really brutal interventions by the CRS yesterday, and a couple people heard at Nanterre, where 1968 began, and in Rennes, I think, no, in Tours. Rather. So, as a matter of fact, when I was teaching in Rouen, I do a course. I've done the last couple of Mays, a course of a couple of weeks there. And the first day, I just only met my students, and we went to a demonstration against Sarkozy in front of the Palace of Justice, and we were outnumbered by the CRS. But and they took photos of all of us. And I think that one of the things that's going to happen in the future is that this is going to be a very tense time, I think. Now, the big strikes in Paris now, of course, which come d'habitude, like all the time, have taken out the trains. About 15% of the trains are running, and the whole line, if you know Paris, the whole metro, the RER, the whole line ligne B, which goes from Saint-Rémy-les-Chevreuse all the way to Roissy, to the airport, is completely shut down. And the buses are running at about 10%. And so it's just chaos. I remember when everybody was on strike when I was teaching in Lyon. I take the trains weren't on strike, but the buses were, and I take the train up to Lyon from where we live, or from near where we live, and I'd have to walk to Bron, which is where Lyon 2 is, and that's about 5 miles or 6 miles, and I mean, it's not a long run or long walk, but people are very inconvenienced. And the other thing that's going on, and the reason that the railroads are out, has nothing to do with the Pécresse law. It has to do with the fact that Sarkozy's attempt to Americanize France it involves sort of withdrawing rights that certain categories of workers received. And there's a lot of anger now in Paris, and in other cities too, against the strikes. And most people in France do not approve of the strikes. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I'll give you an example. People that work on the metro, who are underground, the drivers of the metros, they're underground all the time. I mean, imagine working 8 hours a day and you're underground the whole time. They have the right, in principle, is it 50? Does anyone remember if it's 50? Or Dayin, do you remember if it's 50 or 55 for les chauffeurs de métro? 55? But there's some of the TGV drivers, and that's a big, high-stress occupation. I mean, it's not like driving a plane, but you don't drive a plane. I don't know, you pilot a plane. But, they can have the right to retire at 50. Now, that seems awfully young. And Sarkozy, in his campaign against the ill-fated campaign of Ségolène Royal, said that he wanted to make the French work again. He also said a lot of other provocative things, and for a son of immigrants, a fils des immigrés, who seems to hate immigrants, very provocative things. But anyway, he's going to carry these policies until the very end. And so this is going to happen, quite a lot. I've got a soutenance de thèse, a thesis defense in Lyon, a jury I have to participate in December, and I'm kind of wondering whether this is going to take place. But you can follow this through the newspapers and through the other thing. If you read French and you can follow it through the New York Times online or anything. But you can also get libération.fr, so you can read Libé every day, or you can read Le Monde or whatever if you want to keep up on this. I'm going to be this afternoon calling my student pals in Rouen and finding out what's going on with them. One of them, who's always in every demonstration, he's always there. And at the last time he went out to demonstration, all these police, and they know him because he's in all the demonstrations. And this one policeman said to him, he's got this huge stick, and the student is this little teeny guy, and he has his stick, and he says, I'm reserving this for you, Sven, and all of this. And they have a memory too. But anyway, so ça bouge en France. Maintenant. Well, I want to talk, that is, I think, a logical thing to talk about, because I'm going to talk about anti-Americanism in France. It's hard to talk about anti-Americanism from 1945 until now in a mere 50 minutes. And let me say at the outset that having spent half my life, or half the last 30 years of my life in France, more than that actually, I've never once encountered anti-Americanism. Which sounds avec, it doesn't matter. But what it does, I am saying is that the anti-Americanism in France has always been against the United States policies, and particularly in the earlier days, United States sort of cultural imperialism, but has had nothing to do with anti-Americanism against American people. I've been introduced in a book in which I contributed some sort of random musings about living in Ardèche as a political refugee. In France at various times, and people joke about that. So I'm differentiating, anti-Americanism, like people, they don't like Americans, or with anti-U.S. policies and anti what was considered by many people, particularly intellectuals, sort of a cultural arrogance that risked making France less than what it had always been. And so let me talk a little bit about that. And here I'm drawing heavily at the first part of the lecture on my friend Dick Keisel's book on anti-Americanism in the early stages, but it's an interesting story, and it's one that's worth telling. Now, when I teach in Rouen, I go often to this cafe that's near the railroad station there, and it's a cafe where Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who are well known to almost everybody, used to go all the time. And it's kind of fun to be in a cafe where you imagine that they were. And they were a good example of kind of the intellectual anti-Americanism that emerged after World War II. Now, why did this kind of philosophical and intellectual anti-Americanism emerge? You have to put it in the context of the ideological controversies that emerged out of World War I. And by that I mean from 1945 well into the mid-1950s. There were dock strikes against the arrival of U.S. Military equipment. Remember, the Americans had huge bases in France until the time of de Gaulle. If you go to the town of Châteauroux, which isn't a very interesting town, and the only great restaurant in it left to move to Tours, you would go by these just abandoned airfields that used to just be full of American military Air Force equipment and officers, and so you see a lot of these signs. There were angry outbursts even against the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, as you know from other courses, brought American aid in great quantities to Western Europe. One of the reasons was to keep the Western Europe out of Soviet influence. And this drew predictable attacks from the Parti Communiste, from the Communist Party, because of the obvious ideological division that was the Cold War. And it also was the time when the Rosenbergs in this country were executed. for allegedly passing nuclear secrets to Soviet agents and these kinds of executions, as has been the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, who were anarchists who were executed in 1927. These have, with the mass press, although way before internet, great ramifications. But the French economy grows so rapidly over the next 30 years, the 30 glorious years. And part of the rise of consumerism and a consumer culture in France that was backed by the arrival of such novelties as refrigerators and things like that was very much identified with U.S. culture and was debated particularly by intellectuals rather heatedly. There were pro-American intellectuals who made the case in the very beginning that the American path was the way to go. The most famous was probably Raymond Aron, A-R-O-N, but there were others like Francois Mauriac, and I can't remember if Chips in his book mentions his. I'm sure he does. But the communist intellectuals were adamantly against all things that were American, and of course they were very much over the top. Dick Keisel quotes the famous communist poet Louis Aragon, describing the U.S. as, quote, a civilization of bathtubs and Frigidaires in 1951, as if this was a very bad thing. And he did not mean it, as Keisel says, as a compliment. It was the Parti Communiste, the Communist Party, that coined phrases like the Coca-Colonization of France. And the arrival of Coca-Cola in France was a terribly important moment. More about that in a minute. At the time of the NATO Pact, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, these kinds of debates hit a boiling point. And in an age of graffiti, the graffiti Yankee Go Home was a bit everywhere. Now, the U.S. nuclear capacity, which was, of course, very soon matched by the Soviet nuclear capacity, seemed to raise the cry against the Americans. There was a Stockholm conference in 1950 against nuclear power. And France, is a country that it almost leads the world in the percentage of its energy that is drawn from these nuclear plants, of which several are not all that far from us. And there's a big sort of anti-nuclear reaction now that's mostly through ecologists and the Greens and folks like that. But in the beginning, because the Americans were the ones who had used the nuclear bomb. I mean, other people have never used a nuclear bomb. Never since then have used a nuclear bomb. We live in a world in which Israel has a nuclear bomb, which Pakistan has a nuclear bomb, in which India has a nuclear bomb, as well as France and Britain and China as well, I do believe. So therefore, all this is still very scary. But in the origins, this anti-Americanism was increased by the fear that the Americans and their Cold War against the Soviet Union would turn, that the damage would be not be done in Mississippi or in Minnesota, but would be done in Europe. And so intellectuals also accused the Americans of ignoring European culture. Remember the infamous Donald Rumsfeld referred scathingly to old Europe at a time when the Americans were invading Iraq, as if old Europe with its quaint streets and old churches and long cultures were something not worth remembering. But again, I mean, the critics of American culture were over the top. L'Humanité, the communist newspaper, and still today, said that one could starve even if one owned a telephone. And the telephone, where you can't even find a fixed phone anymore. I can't even call on the phone when I go back to University of Michigan, because there are literally only one fixed phone left on the campus. And I don't have a cell phone, because I don't like cell phones. I can't stand them. I agree with those people who said that they had great faith in humanity until the cell phone. And plus, my daughter's lost 3 of them already. that the French Minister of Communications in 1964, this is the French Minister of Communications in 1964, avant vous, before you existed, but not before I existed. He called the telephone a gimmick in 1964. But it wasn't the telephone that drew heat. It was above all, well, the refrigerators. I mean, you couldn't tell the average housewife living wherever in the Morbihan or someplace, in Brittany or wherever, that the refrigerator wasn't a good deal. But that for the Communist Party, a frigidaire, a refrigerator, a frigidaire, which is a model, I don't know if it still is, was only good for making ice cubes for fancy aperitif, where you would drink American or Scottish, American bourbon or Scotch whiskey. Aragon, this again is the communist poet, wrote, "A Ford automobile, the civilization of Detroit, the assembly line, the atomic danger, encircled by napalm." Now he said this early on. Remember, it's the Americans who used napalm in Vietnam. It was the Americans who used napalm in Vietnam. Here is a symbol of the subjugation to the dollar, applauded even in the land of Molière. The Yankee, more arrogant than the Nazi Holocaust, I mean, this is absurd, substitutes the machine for the poet, Coca-Cola for poetry, the Ford for Victor Hugo. It degenerated to that extent. A great sociologist called Edgar Morin, who has a brilliant book called The Red and the White about a Breton village, he called Reader's Digest a pocket-sized stupefier, a drug for little minds. And he was one of the earliest to attack Franglais, and more about that in a while. That is the absorption of American terms into the French language. Toothpaste, for example, instead of dentifrice, flooding the French language. But again, you have to put this in the context of the times, and that's what historians try to do. 60% of the people in the Communist Party thought the U.S. was readying an aggressive war, and almost 95% of people in the Communist Party were against the presence of U.S. bases in France. Now remember, the guy who got rid of the U.S. bases in France was Charles de Gaulle, who was anything but a communist, who was completely opposite of a communist. But his view, as we'll see, was that France had to be, to maintain its status as a great power, had to be, have a neutral path and influence in places where French was spoken, particularly in West and North Africa, and in the Middle East, in parts, in Lebanon, and things like that. There were some, intellectuals who tried to find a third way, who weren't kind of parroting the Communist Party, or were going to kowtow the way Sarkozy is to America. Le Monde, for example, which is, without question the most reputable newspaper in France, though Libé is quite good too, and plutôt à mon goût. But it took a more neutral position in all of this, because there were many people in France who weren't communists that thought that the Marshall Plan was a way of buying off Europe. And I wasn't, I was vaguely around in those days, but the fear was, after World War I, there was a thought that nobody will ever want another war. After World War II, and after the atomic bomb, and after the horrors of all that had happened, and the Holocaust, people were quite certain that there would be another war. So it was a time of great fear, and so these were big issues. In 1952, at the time of the visit of U.S. General Matthew Ridgway to take control of NATO forces, there were huge demonstrations against the United States. He was called a butcher in the Korean War, which certainly wasn't true. He was called a war criminal, and that wasn't true either. But this came at a time when it was the government of a guy who just died only a couple of years ago, lived to be about 130 years old, called Antoine Pinet, who was from Saint-Chamond near Saint-Étienne, if I remember correctly, and he had been accused of collaboration during the war, and he was in power. And he tried to, ludicrously enough, break the influence of the Parti Communiste. And one of their leaders, I didn't know about this incident until I read Keisel, one of the incidents was he accused Jacques Duclos name you could forget, but he was an interesting guy who was the leader of the Communist Party, of being a spy for the Soviets. And his proof was that they had found 2 dead pigeons in the back seat of his car, and an autopsy on the birds. That he thought they were carrier pigeons that were smuggling, going to send secrets off to some Soviet spies somewhere out of the country. And of course they did an autopsy on these birds, and they discovered, I don't know how you do this to an autopsy. I didn't want to be in the room, but they were not carrier pigeons, but they were pigeons. People in France eat pigeons, pigeonneaux, and that they simply, he would have them in his back seat because he was going to take home and cook them, hopefully with lots of garlic, and to eat them. And Jean-Paul Sartre, he said at the same time that if he had to choose sides in the Cold War, he would choose the USSR. Now, Sartre, like lots of fellow travelers, were delusional about what had happened in Stalin's Soviet Union. His partner, Simone de Beauvoir, who was terribly important in the rise of feminism, as I'm sure you know, she came to the U.S. in 1947. She had been in 1947, and she liked this sort of dynamism of the American economy, and she liked its freedom, but she was immediately suspicious of racism in the United States, and the 1940s and the 1950s, as indeed in our own time, sadly, though not as much, was a time of racism, and she said so. She came right out and said, and that became a part of the anti-American discourse, because when the Americans would get holier now about how people in Europe treated their minorities, all you had to look to the United States, where I can think back my own childhood when the three freedom workers were so brutally murdered in Mississippi, they would point to that. Now, what about the role of Coca-Cola in all of this? I imagine you may have seen Coca-Cola a few times in your lives. It still is so identified with America. And it probably is, I think it's fair to say, the single item that is most identified in the rest of the world with the United States. That you couldn't talk to people in France or anywhere else about baseball, and you could not talk to them about hot dogs, though this strange thing emerged in the 1960s called le hot dog, which are 2 sort of miserably, almost frozen Frankfurters with some sort of god-awful cheese put on them and put in what was then the equivalent of a microwave, but it was Coca-Cola. And as you know, the product was created, I think, in the late 1880s. It's very hard to get into, though Kaiser managed to do it, to get into the Coca-Cola archives. So you might find that recipe. And of course, I think somebody told me that cocaine was put originally into Coke at the beginning of it all. Let me give you some examples how Coke and American view of itself and view of the world came to be. We will see that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he is, and whatever it costs was what Coca-Cola had to say about the relationship between soldiers if they survived the Bataan Death March and whatever, that was it. Coca-Cola actually sent people as technical observers, a phrase they used, to see where bottling plants could, after the fighting ended, be set up in Europe. One U.S. soldier wrote a letter in which he said, "To my mind, I am in this damn mess, as much to help to keep the custom of drinking Cokes as I am to preserve the million other benefits our country blesses its citizens with." 64 bottling plants were set up in Europe after the war. Immediately after the war, within a couple years, they expand to Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands in 1947, also to Switzerland and Italy, and then to France in 1949. The Olympics of 1950 were held in Finland, in Helsinki. and there was had not yet been time to build a Coca-Cola plant. So what they did is they got a hold of some D-Day landing vessels, filled them with Coca-Cola, and the Coca-Cola company landed on the shores of Finland, literally with all these publicity material and with 720,000 bottles of Coca-Cola. Now, the chairman of, I didn't know this either until I read Keisel. The chairman of Coca-Cola was James Farley, who was a former aide to Franklin Roosevelt, and thus he was had good contacts. And he was a militant anti-communist who identified the drinking of Coca-Cola with democracy. The Soviets and in their satellite states did not drink Coca-Cola, but good old Americans drank Coca-Cola. Now, you're going to run into huge lobbies in these countries. In Belgium, you're going to run into the beer lobby, terribly important. In the Pays-Bas, in the Netherlands, you're going to run into the beer lobby. And in France, you will run head on to that lobby you already know something about, the wine lobby, which in a way is neither left nor right, but it's neither left nor right. It's a little more complicated than that. And they tried to stir up popular action against Coca-Cola. A communist paper in Italy said that drinking Coke would make children's hair turn white, and therefore you shouldn't do that. In Austria, the biggest communist newspaper in Vienna wrote that Coca-Cola plants, by virtue of the machines they use, could be easily transformed into plants capable of turning out nuclear bombs. And so that good Viennese and good Austrians should avoid the insidious numbing drink. Cokes had begun to arrive in France after World War I, but only in very small numbers and extremely fancy cafes. And so the Coca-Cola, Keisel got into the archives to find all this. Coca-Cola marketers divided France into 6 regions and figured that they should anticipate each person drinking 6 Coca-Colas per year. The problem is that foreign investments, such as building plants, required the permission of the Ministry of Finance. And that all this anxiety comes along. The Ministry of Finance gets involved in all of this business. The debate reaches the Chamber of Deputies in 1950s. And also this merges with other fears of other American products. John Deere. Some of you may be from Illinois. Isn't that where John Deere has made the tractors and all that? And that is by far the biggest company a successful company in marketing machinery that's been part of the French agricultural revolution since World War II. But of course, the little producers in France were against John Deere as well. It also comes at a time, as you know, of a widespread outrage of intellectuals and filmmakers against the Hollywoodization of French French movie theaters. And because France's attitudes towards its own movies has always been that as its attitudes toward almost all industrial production, that France makes these fine little products of quality, and the arrival of the, God forbid, the Charlton Hestons of the world and John Wayne and all of this stuff. So these debates are going on among intellectuals and film watchers, etc. These debates just go on and on. There are radio stations in France now have to play a certain percentage of French music as opposed to Bruce Springsteen and the Stones and whatever. They have to have a certain percentage, and so there is still this paranoia that English or French music or other kinds of music coming will wipe out what's left of the French music industry, and that people won't play Jacques Brel anymore, or Georges Brassens, or Léo Ferré, or Johnny Hallyday, who was born Belgian, and he has his own problems, so it has nothing to do with it. But yet, when there are these, there are these debates, it seemed like the ties between Coke and the U.S. government were even stronger. Coca-Cola demanded that the U.S. State Department intervene in some way to stop this kind of uprising against the arrival of Coca-Cola. U.S. papers went wild. Coca-Cola was not injurious to the health of American soldiers who liberated France from the Nazis so that communist deputies could sit in session today, was one editorial in a U.S. paper. You can't spread the doctrines of Marx among people who drink Coca-Cola. The dark principles of revolution and a rising proletariat may be expounded over a bottle of vodka on a scarred table, such as Maury's or some place like that, or even a bottle of brandy. But it's utterly fantastic to imagine two men stepping to a soda fountain and ordering a couple of Cokes in which to toast the downfall of their capitalist oppressors. And so it went. But Coca-Cola arrived in France. It got permission to be produced in France and to be drunk in France, and still is, though often by American tourists in France. I have been on several occasions in really good, in one case even great, and this is not dissing Americans, forgive me, great restaurants, and seeing Americans ordering Coca-Cola with their 4 or 5 course meal, and that does make me sad. Does it make me sound like a snob? I've seen people drink milk too and things like that. Anyway, what can we say? I shouldn't get so so involved in all this stuff. How did people like Coca-Cola? A poll, a sondage. The French take to American polls. I mean, do these polls all the time. A sondage is the word for a poll. In 1953, said only 70% people who drank it liked it, and 60% not at all, and the other ones couldn't remember because they'd gone on to something else, drinking something else, I guess. But the dikes began to break, and millions of Cokes are sold every year in France as everywhere. Now, this is just an aside, but this is the same case as in Africa. The debates have not been the same, but one of the interesting things, and I think sad things about the places I know in Africa, which are very few, but I have family members who know Africa pretty well, is that the domination of Coke, particularly in places that are Muslim, in which people don't drink alcoholic beverages, the domination of Coke and Fanta, which are very, very expensive for people who have almost no money. And the Fanta becomes the equivalent of a celebration with champagne in France or the United States or someplace where people drink. And so some of the same issues, some of the same debates are there. And these companies just make zillions off these drinks. And I'm not criticizing these companies, am I? I guess, I don't know. But anyway, now let's talk about some of the other aspects of anti-Americanism before I end in 15 minutes or so with the obvious ones today. Well, architecture, for example. Many of the debates about preservation, about keeping Paris, Poitiers, anywhere you want to name, the beautiful center, Strasbourg, the way they have always been, have involved fighting against the skyscraperization, if you will, the gratte-ciel, les gratte-ciel, the skyscrapers in France. In the late 1960s, there was a huge debate over the Tour Montparnasse. And the Tour Montparnasse, it's where the station of Montparnasse is in Paris. It's right right beyond the Boulevard Montparnasse. There was built with the enthusiastic cooperation, if not, money in the pockets, of Georges Pompidou, the president of France, who said we must renounce this outmoded aesthetic. That's an exact quote. And so the big battle over the Tour de France, which is here I give my own view, but it gives it's a hideous building that is a blight on the skyline of Paris. And it was said the only thing good about it is you can't see it when you're viewing Paris from the top. And they have an elevator that shoots up to the top, and it destroyed well, anyway, what can one say? It's an obvious thing. Now, people that defended the Tour Montparnasse, which is identified with Chicago, and the skyscrapers, would say, well, look, when people criticize the Tour Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower, when it was built in 1888 and 1889, and Zola was among those who signed saying this is awful, it must go, and it is part of what people go to see. Now, people do not go to see the Tour Montparnasse because the Eiffel Tower, represented changes in industry and steel and iron and all of this stuff, and the Tour Montparnasse just represents a kind of an American approach to architecture that the traditionalists found wanting. And so what they did subsequently is they built La Défense, which is outside of Paris, but you can see it if you stand, for example, in the Tuileries, or around there. You can see it beyond the Arc de Triomphe, and that's where lots of business is. That's the kind of Americanization of French architecture and business. But generally, the French have been very good of trying to protect Paris from the planners who would destroy the way the place looks with an Americanized kind of architecture. There have been other problems too. I mean, the constructions at Place d'Italie and the Tour Montparnasse became only the most famous. And appropriately enough, these kinds of battles to protect Paris against this kind of architecture have involved the far right, conservative right, not the facho, the fascist right, but the far right, like my late friend Louis Chevalier, a very conservative man who was the greatest historian of Paris, or my friend François Loyer, who is now head of the Committee to Preserve Old Paris, with people on the left, the sort of the French equivalent of me, against the center, against the kind of planeur who just want to make money. But other aspects of Americanization, the word pavillon in France. People wanted to have their houses in the prosperous suburbs, if best. Saint-Remy-les-Chevreuse, for example. Most of the suburbs, the time we're talking about until 1945 are miserable places. But the people in Saint-Germain-en-Laye in the west of Paris or Versailles, they want to have their pavillon, which was a big kind of modern Americanized house with all these things. Cell phones, refrigerators, all this business, swimming pools and lawns. What could be more American than lawns? Now, the vast majority of the people who live in the Parisian region do not live in houses. They live in apartments. And the vast majority live in buildings that they do not own. Or not the vast majority, but the majority do. But that became a big issue. The television. People thought the television would destroy France. I used to say that when Charles de Gaulle died, finally, Colombe des Églises, he died of boredom watching French TV. Because French TV, which has some of the best stuff around, but also has some of the worst, This talk shows that go on and on and on. It's just numbing. But also, they took all these things that I've never watched in my life, like Dallas. I used to be a big show and all these things. I have no idea what they are, but people, even our very dear friends, you go there and they're watching this stuff. And well, I mean, the TV is not just American, but that whole that kind of culture was identified with America. And intellectuals didn't like that very much. People should be reading books, and they should be reading books too. But who am I to say? I mean, I watch ESPN, hours every day in every game that's on, so I can't really say I don't watch TV. Clothing. It used to be, in the first years that I was living in France or went to France, you could tell who was an American in about 1 second by looking at their feet. Now, I don't spend a lot of time looking at people's feet, but you could tell the way they looked because they wore tennis shoes, and tennis shoes now are called basket, but now everybody wears the same way, and jeans the same thing because there weren't jeans in France. Now everybody wears jeans. I can still tell who's American and who isn't usually, but the clothing was identified with America was seen as being somehow un-French, and of course there's the big war between France, high couture, of French fashion, and trying to preserve, as Milan tries to also, and they've been very successful at that. But clothing was one thing as well. Euro Disney, what can one say about Euro Disney? Somebody called it a cultural Chernobyl. Chernobyl was the big nuclear plant that blew up in Kiev. And certainly the idea of Mickey Mouse and Goofy and all these people, and you go, I've never been there. I would never walk in the place. You spend 50 balles, you spend 50 euro to get in, and so your kids can get sick eating American cotton candy. But again, people go over the top. Or McDonald's, ha ha. McDonald's, which started in France really in the 80s. Burger King tried and failed. Now McDonald's is a big issue. And José Bové, who came to Yale a couple years ago, José Bové is a guy who now became identified with the struggle against McDonald's. He was actually lived for 2 years in LA, though he speaks English. I wasn't here when he came. My daughter was a translator for him and introduced him and all that. But he's one who led the struggle to try to, first of all, to preserve his part of the Aviron, Larzac, against making a strafing practice range for the French Air Force, and has gone after McDonald's as representing the globalization that's going to hurt local commerce. Now McDonald's has tried to compromise in some ways. If you go get a McDonald's, and I won't go into places, I shouldn't say that because of recording this, but haven't been in years in France. But they have these little salads with a few pieces of goat's cheese in it to go along with the 2 million calorie burger and all that. But what José Bové did is that he and his friends went up and broke up. Didn't hurt anybody, but they sort of trashed a McDonald's in Millau, which is in Aviron in the south, right near this huge bridge, the biggest span bridge in Europe. And of course, he went on trial, and he became, a presidential candidate. And I guess my daughter says he's a really great guy. But McDonald's became an issue. And I said, well, maybe it won't work. But McDonald's, because you can eat cheaply there, because everything's so expensive in France, so expensive. They're always just, when you could drive by, there's one in Aubenas, there's one everywhere. They're always full of people eating whatever it is they eat there. So it became a symbol more important than the reality. McDo, comme on dit en français, became a symbol of globalization, first of Americanization and then of globalization. And then, what comes along now but Starbucks. There's 3 or 4. There's one in the Marais in Paris. There's one I saw in somewhere up Opéra, and there are a couple other ones there, and they soon will be everywhere. And even hypermarché, supermarkets. Now, people don't dispute supermarkets anymore, but they used to. The big ones are Leclerc and Auchan and Mammut and all these. Leclerc is probably the biggest, the upscale version, Intermarché. Now, I remember in the 1970s that people thought that supermarkets were just terrible things. Why? Because they were going to and did destroy local commerce. That most villages now do not have the little épicerie, that grocery store that made it possible for old ladies to walk a few, equivalent of a few hundred meters to buy their milk. And now they can't do that anymore. Now, it's more than just a disappearance of a way of buying food. It's a disappearance of a place where you get together and exchange news in the morning. Our grocery store disappeared about 10 years ago, or about 8 years ago, because everybody goes to the supermarché. Hypermarché, supermarché, c'est la même chose. Though the other thing that it could attack, but it could interfere with, and has not as much as we feared, were markets. The Saturday market, the Wednesday market, the Saturday and Wednesday market, depending on the size of the town, that are all over France. And in fact, people still, even young people your age, still have a sense that you've got to protect, you've got to save the markets. And you've got the people that produce there, that bring what they produce in their fields there, buy goat's cheese, picodon, whatever, wine from producers directly. And that's part of the ambiance. That's what's great about living in France, or living in Germany, or living in Pays-Bas, or living anywhere in Belgium. And so many people will go and buy the big things of milk and the big items, paper towels and all that, but then they will still go to the market, not just for a trip of nostalgia, but because the products they know they're buying from people they know and all that. So that fear was probably turned out to be less than one had worried about. And then, of course, there's the question of Franglais. Every about, maybe 5 or 6, 7 years, somebody in one of the ministries gets it into his or her head that Franglais has to disappear from the vocabulary, the official vocabulary, the administrative vocabulary of France. Franglais is the absorption into daily parlance of words that are non-French, of which the first one that really took over, at least in my memory, was le weekend. And there were attempts, I think under Giscard d'Estaing, and there's one even more recently, under early stages of Jacques Chirac's presidency, to send stern circulars around saying in a correspondence you shall not use le weekend, but you would rather use la fin de la semaine, the end of the week. Well, I mean, that lasted a matter of days because that's simply not terribly practical. English words began to permeate with this sort of chic sense of being cool, the French language. Le drugstore. I can remember around Paris Saint-Germain at the metro there en face, right across, there was Le drugstore. And it was a pharmacy. It had your basic green flashing light saying it's a pharmacy. But they also sold all sorts of things. So it was almost like anticipating a supermarket, and the term was Le drugstore. It wasn't une pharmacie, it was or la pharmacie, it was le drugstore, and people debated that. You could go on and on about this. I'll just give you a couple examples. I mean, these are obvious ones. I just wrote them down because they're obvious. But après les sweaters, sweaters d'hiver, voici les fully fashioned des beaux jours. Nous, c'est smart, S-M-A-R-T, voilà. Votre shopping club. Le véritable wash and wear, les drinks des gens raffinés, the drink of people who are refined. Now, this had already started to happen in the 1890s with certain terms, as I suggested when I was talking about Émile Henry, that began to the long drink, for example, that began to infiltrate the French language. The hot dog became le chien chaud in these times of these various commands. But basically, with globalization and with the American cultural dominance, these attempts are basically just putting small fingers in very large dikes. Why did it matter so much, all of this? It's because France is no longer a great power. And intellectuals and lots of other people in France, including me, are determined that French culture retain its place in the world. And I am chronically sad to see another supermarket go up where there have already been two of them. It saddens me terribly to see the Golden Arches almost everywhere now. And Subway, which is a chain I actually happen to like a lot, and those are becoming all over the place. So we're fighting against the waves that cannot be cannot be halted, but in a way may not be all a very bad thing, so long as a sense of perspective is maintained, and that often was not maintained in the early days of the almost hysterical battle against the mounting empire of Coca-Cola. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving vacation. See you next time, and go blue.